Welcome to a quick session on marketing and promoting literary translation. Um, this is a brief session. I've written a fair bit about it on my website, so I'll share that at the end as well. My name is Jenny Bout, and I am a literary translator from Gujarati to English. Gujarati is a Western Indian language. And I am a fiction writer, I am a book critic, and I also teach creative writing at Writing Workshop Dallas. And Dallas, Texas is where I'm based. So thank you for taking the time to watch this, and I hope it will be useful to you. Get started. So what I'd like to do is just do a brief introduction to the topic. I'll talk about how we begin defining our readership and crafting our messaging about our books. There's a couple of useful frameworks that I found very useful even back in my non-translation days, back when I was working in the corporate world. And so I'll share those. I've tweaked them a little bit for book marketing, so I'll share those. And then I want to talk a little bit about networking and citizenship, particularly in terms of how they can help us with marketing and promoting our books. And then I'll just wrap up with a summary. So what I'd like to start off by saying is, let's say, we've got this amazing book that we've written, translated, and we want to, get it to readers. Now, translating and getting the book published in itself is a big enough project, as we all know. And getting it to readers, I've found in my experience, is entirely a separate project of its own. And one of the things I often tell folks who ask me is that writing or translating and publication are two separate things. They are two separate things. And unfortunately, the world that we live in today, it's not enough to just do the work. We then have to evangelize and get it out there. And I think of this as, even the most hardy plants need the right soil and weather conditions to thrive, right? And so you may have one of the best books that, you're very happy about, and you think the world should all read it. And if only they read it, they will know how good it is, because you've spent the last few years of your life working on it. But unless we've created the right soil and weather conditions, it's not going to thrive as well as it should. And so that's how I approach this whole thing about marketing, which I know many of us have a little queasiness about, because it's not something that we do on a regular basis. But it's important to get that mindset right about why we're doing it. Another reason is that oftentimes when we're translating from one language or one culture into another, the target readership is often unaware, right? I mean, I started out saying I translate from Gujarati to English, and I guarantee a lot of you watching don't necessarily know the writer that I translated, or even the language necessarily. So it's important that we talk more about the book and market it in a particular way, because people won't know about it otherwise. We also know the stats, right, about translations in the US market. They make up about 3%, although that number seems to be improving year over year due to the efforts of many literary translators themselves to make people more aware of the state of the industry. In the UK book market, I think it's a little better. It's about 6%, but still less than 6% of the overall UK book market. So when you think about how many books are coming out every single day, and then translations being such a small percentage of them, it makes it even more important for us to do certain important marketing things to get the word out there. And so one of the things I say as literary translators is that we have to amplify our works in somewhat unconventional ways, right? We have to do things that are a little bit different because of the nature of the market and the visibility or the lack of visibility that translations have. And I like to use this signal versus noise graphic. It actually comes from the world of software development, but I think it works pretty much for any kind of news or media environment as well. And what we're aiming for with what we do with our marketing, because there's a lot of noise out there. Every single day there's a gazillion books, right, getting out there. And what you want to do is get just that right balance of information and messaging out there, and so that it's more meaningful. It's you want to be in that clarity box, which is more signal and less noise. If you're going to do too much of it, it's going to become, it may be more signal, but it's also going to be a lot of noise, and people tune out. And so you want to figure out that right balance, which will be very particular to your book. And it's not necessarily the journey of another book. So you're kind of charting the journey of this particular book in the way that it fits this book's messaging and literary merits. And so the first place we start, and I think this is where everything starts. Where everything starts is understanding our readership. Now, chances are, if you had to pitch your book before it even got published to agents and publishers, you've already thought quite a bit about who your book's ideal readers are. And you've already thought a bit about what do they read. And I don't mean just what other books they read, but also which news and social media sites they might frequent. Where do they meet, whether it's in person or online communities? You want to get a good sense of this. This is something that kind of underpins all of the other stuff that I'm going to talk about in a little while here. And as I said, you're looking at where they meet, but look beyond the usual news or social medias. Look at whether they're, your target readers might be at educational institutions, there might be book clubs. Look beyond literary festivals, look to cultural festivals where you might find readers, even recreational spaces. And this is, you're brainstorming at this stage. Doesn't mean you're going to have to cover that wide swath of venues, but you're just trying to figure out where your readers are. And there's a particular kind of reader who might go to multiple spaces, right, for different reasons. So think of each reader venue combination as a separate segment, if you will. And ideally, you're doing this work several months. I mean, I would say 6 months at the least, but 9 months at the most, before the book launch date. The reason being, you want to start to get a sense of what these readers are talking about, or how they select their books and how they approach, what they're looking for, right, in their reading. So you want to be connecting with some of the potential readers several months before. Now, one thing I find is a lot of writers and translators, they'll go to, as the usual, they'll go to social media or online communities, and they'll interact with fellow translators and writers and critics and journalists, right? And this is not the same thing as interacting with potential readers. Certainly, fellow translators, writers, critics, all these people will help the book's journey into the world, of course, and we'll talk a bit about that. But they're not necessarily your target readership. And so what I'm talking about is the person who doesn't really even know, about that publisher and this review. They just know, oh, that book sounds interesting, or, that's from a language that's my mother tongue, so I want to know more about it. And so those are your readers, and those are the ones who are going to be buying your books. All the other folks most likely will be getting review copies. They're not book buyers. Okay. The second step, I think, which is most important before we get into anything else, is, okay, you figured out who your readers are, where they might be, and then you have to think about messaging. And I know this sounds too capitalistic and too, business-like, but think about how much information comes at us through 24/7 news and social media. If we want our book to stand a chance, we have to figure some key points out about our book that will be of interest. And so part of that means looking at how the book stands apart from other books that are out around the same time or the same year, and what are some of the key points you'd like readers to take away. I'll give you an example. When my translation came out in the US last year, it was the very first Gujarati to English translation published in the US, even though among the South Asian American diaspora, Gujarati is the third most spoken language. And so, for that to be the first book, it was also the very first translation of that particular writer who is known as the pioneer of the Gujarati short story. So those points were some of my book's key messaging points. And there were a few more, which you can always check if you go to my website. That's, one thing I want to be clear on is we often talk about books in terms of the book's value, but sometimes we start talking more about the author or maybe about ourselves in terms of the book's messaging, and that's sometimes I've seen that happen, and I would caution against that. You want to make sure that your messaging is about the book's value to the reader. Why would the reader pick up that book, right? What's in it for them? Why would they be interested? If possible, if the book happens to be, topical enough and you can connect it to topical issues of interest, then fine, do so. For example, if you're translating a Russian novel, which is about war at some point or another in history, you could still find a way to maybe connect that to what's going on in that part of the world right now. But do it in a sincere way. Don't just piggyback on something because it's zeitgeisty, right? Don't shy away from raising controversial points, but obviously back it up, with evidence and substance. So if you're going to talk about how your book addresses certain controversial issues in the news, make sure that it does indeed do that and that there is evidence that it does that, right? I wouldn't go beyond having 4 or 5 such points. Simple, substantial, that you can tweak them for different formats, different venues. That's all. What you're trying to do is shape and guide and manage the narrative around your book. Now, some of this work can be done if you have a publisher who is hands-on enough, or if you have a publicist who is hands-on enough, you would do these things with the publicist and the publisher. Unfortunately, I find that with literary translations, even though you may have very good and strong publishers and publicists, they may not know the language that you're translating from, or the culture, or even, the literary lineage that book comes from. So I found it more useful to take a more active role in shaping this messaging along with my publisher. And I've been lucky enough to work with some good publishers, so that always helps. And finally, hone these points. Obviously, in the earlier bit, I talked about the readership segments, where the reader plus venue, readership segments. So you want to tweak some of these points, have 4 or 5 points, but then hone those for each of the segments that you want to target, that you want to work, get your book out and get your message out to. Now, this is the first useful framework. Some of you may be familiar with this. If this is not your first translation, or, if you kind of, know a little bit about marketing, this is the funnel, the marketing and sales funnel. I've simplified it. You're going to see different versions of this out there. And one of the things that I like is to not just think of the funnel in terms of the product and what you want the market to do. I've added the reader part. You want to think about what the reader is trying to do. So where you're trying to attract a reader and make them aware, a reader's also out there trying to discover what their next read might be. Where you're trying to engage with the reader, and the reader is busy assessing, the book's merits based on how you're engaging. Where you're trying to convert the reader so that they may buy, the reader's purchase decision, the reader is looking to make a purchase decision based on the activities you take to help them convert. And then once they've bought your book, your hope will be, or you hope that you will retain them, meaning when your next book comes out, they will still come and buy. And so you want that retention, and the reader simply wants to connect. If they liked your book, they'll be like, oh, let me go look up this author. Let me see what else they've done, And so for each of these four stages of the marketing and sales funnel, there are different things we can do, right? I'm going to suggest a few things. Doesn't mean you have to go do all of them. We'll talk a bit more about that. But let me just give you an idea. So there are things, for example, to help the reader discover this book that you've now put out into the world. Things like your website, your press release, all the different book selling, I won't name names, but all the different book selling venues that are out there online, book recommendation venues, review venues, libraries, publication venues where you're writing other kinds of publications. And a reader might discover your name by reading that. For example, I do a lot of book reviews, and so sometimes readers find me because they read a review of a book they like, and then they went to my website and then discovered my book, my own work there. Micro-influencers are growing, actually. They're not so micro anymore, but these are all the folks you find on social media, often who are, or they have their own blogs, and they do blog tours and all kinds of things, or they'll have newsletters about books. So those are the people who readers do follow, and oftentimes discover books because of those micro-influencers. There's also paid advertising and sponsored content. I'll talk a bit more about those, each of these actually, as we get through here. The second stage is how you engage with potential readers. This is where you're having some actual interaction or contact, whether it's literary or cultural events, social media, institutions, workshops if you teach, online communities if you're a member of any of them, newsletters, things that you're putting out there, and you're engaging, and then the reader might assess whether, based on all these engagements or interactions, if they want to find out more about your work. Once you've done some of that, there are resources that you can add, free resources most of the time, unfortunately, but that will convince your reader to purchase. Oftentimes it's things like book club and reading resources, reading guides, just discussion questions if you don't have time to create lengthy inextensive book club guides. Just a set of discussion questions. A PDF file would be good enough. Free excerpts. There are venues that will publish excerpts of published or soon to be published books, and so those are always useful because they give people a good taste of what the book is about. Interviews, essays you might write around the topics of your book, the messaging of your book, and then genuine endorsements from peers. I'll talk a bit more about that towards the end as well. And then once, let's say you've got people engaged and some of them have even converted and bought your book, and now you want to make sure that, you retain them. I don't suggest any particularly different activities for retention, but I do say revisit selected aspects of stages 1 and 2. So keep that little bit of information about your work out there. Keep that little bit of engagement. Select where you want to do that, but keep that, don't just disappear after your book is done, because people have short-term memories and there's so many books coming out there. So you need to be somewhat visible if you're going to have another book coming out there and not have to redo everything all over again, right? So again, as I said, don't try to do it all. Those were suggestions. Be selective, focus on and prioritize based on the reader segments you've identified. What is the best way to reach them and to present your book's messaging? So again, just remember, more signal, less noise. That's what we want. The second useful framework, and I'm not using the graphic, but you can go to the SpinSucks website. Jenny Dietrich created this. It's a marketing framework. I've tweaked it for books, for the book marketing, and so that's what I'm going to talk about. And it's called the PESO model, which is paid media, earned media, shared or social media, and owned media. So let's talk quickly about those and then we'll wrap up. Paid media is where you're paying, right, for search ads or social media ads, sponsored content, or even books. There are book selling and recommendation websites that, allow you to buy advertising. Now, they can be effective if you go to the right venues and if your book fits that kind of, if your reader segments, if your readers are there. So they can be effective. I don't personally find these the best approach. I haven't done these. I did these for my very first, my own book, my own fiction. I have not done this for any of my translation work. So I don't find those the best approach. But again, depends on what you're translating. If it's more a certain kind of commercial book, you never know. Ideally, even if you are going to do advertising, if you're doing it at a website, native advertising, where the ad is more in line and it looks like it's part of the website, that tends to work better than these pop-ups that just go boom, boom in your face, Earned media is where other people are including your book on reading lists, the ones you see like most anticipated or best books of such and such month and year. There's reviews that include trade reviews that come out 2-3 months before the book comes out, interviews, podcasts, essays that might be commissioned for you, your essays commissioned to be published, excerpts, literary and cultural events. I put these here because when you are selected or invited to those events, that's really earned media. That's because they feel, you're not paying them. It's earned, and you don't own it, so you can't call it owned media either. Now, typically, if you have a good publisher, they will manage the lists and reviews and excerpts, because generally, especially in the US and the UK, journalists and book reviewers are not going to interact directly with you. And so if you have a good publisher to manage getting the review copies out to these venues so that your book can be included on lists and stuff, that's great. What I found is, sometimes if that doesn't happen, you can also pitch a reading list that is similar, a reading list of books that is similar to your book. And so sometimes we're in uncharted territory, right? You might have a book that is nothing like any other. And so people aren't going to know how to put it on a reading list. And so you have to kind of prime the pump a little. And so you might pitch reading lists, right? You might pitch essays talking about some of the messaging that you've got around the book. You could, if you don't have a publisher who is able to stretch their resources enough to do some of the work of getting review copies out there and follow-up emails and everything, you could hire an independent book publicist. This is a huge minefield, I will be honest with you. I've heard some horror stories, and so be very careful, do your homework, do your due diligence, set a budget, and again, you have to reach out to them at least 9 months before so that they can start with you 6 months before the book is due out. Any later than that, and you won't find a good publicist even willing to take the book on. And then for all the rest of those things, choose your venues carefully. Now that we're out of the pandemic, physical events are still the best way to engage and convert. You're going to find when you're doing Zoom sessions, there's no buy button there, right? People aren't necessarily going to go away and buy your book unless you've included that as part of the session that they have to buy it to register, which doesn't happen that often. But if you're at a physical event, you're doing a talk, and people feel that connection, they're going to pick up the book and want you to sign it. So physical events are still the best way to connect. Moving on to shared and social media. This is the one that we all know a lot, right? Because we're all trying to get there and make sure that we have a presence. These are the micro-influencers. You could have co-promotions where you and another writer or translator are doing something together. But remember the social part. I can't stress this enough. Treat others like you want to be treated. Don't just suddenly reach out to people out of the blue and say, oh, here's my book, So be respectful of tags and mentions and DMs. I can't say enough about this. And, it's too much when people are trying to be on social media for other reasons and then someone's just trying to overtly sell them something, right? And don't spend the majority of the time simply promoting your book. Again, that's going to be more noise, less signal. People are going to tune out. There's lots of best practice guidelines out there. You can Google and find, in terms of what's best for, sharing your work and putting things out at every different platform, whichever ones you select you want to be on. Personally, I always say decide what you've got the time and energy for. There's a cognitive, load to doing this kind of work. Just going on social media and sharing something isn't enough. You then have to interact, you have to engage, you have to respond. And so that takes time. You can't be everywhere all at once. Pick what you're comfortable with, pick where your readers are going to be found more than others. If you're unsure, look at what authors and translators that you respect are doing. Now, I will say that, put a caveat to that. There are some translators who seem to be everywhere. I don't know how they have the time, but they seem to be everywhere and they seem to be engaging, interacting. Do what is comfortable for you. If you're uncomfortable and you spend too much time doing that, it's just going to be tiring and exhausting. So define your boundaries and always make sure you're consistent with your messaging. My personal note, I've found social media more useful to connect with other translators and authors and editors rather than book buying readers. I rarely find that. There's a handful, of course, people who I've interacted with and then they've said, I went and got your book. But in general, the social media stuff has helped me get, essays or reviews commissioned, but not so much the book itself. Yeah, people's mileage varies though. So finally, owned media. To me, this is where we have the most control and where we can do the most, right? And I would think of the website as the central hub. If you don't have a good, strong website, I strongly urge you to have one. It is a central hub for all your book-related information and all the resources you might choose to create, whether it's messaging, have a page for the book with all of that on there, your book blurbs, any downloadable resources you might have created, any interviews that you do. Everything should be easily accessible, easy to find. Don't bury things on the website or spam people with them. Make sure there's an easy way for media to contact you. You would be amazed how many times I've been to a translator's or an author's website and they don't have a contact page, or they'll have an email buried somewhere and it's very hard to find. So make things easy for a journalist or another translator or writer if they want to contact you, right? Keep your consistency with all the crafted messaging. That's why I put that up front. Make sure there's consistency, because otherwise, again, there's more noise and less signal. Again, there is a cost and time element to doing all this. And so if you're not up to it, get the expertise. I would say more than even an independent publicist, I would invest time here. This is something you can control. And as with all such things, be a little creative, be consistent, be sincere. And newsletters, they do work. They are a lot of work and they do work, but you need to provide value beyond just sending out personal updates. If your newsletter is just, I went here and I did this and I, had this interview and then I did that, I'm not so sure you're going to have a lot of traction. Don't spam inboxes. Don't just send your book. Have some value. Be respectful of the reader's trust and their time, right? They have a lot of options out there. They have a lot of newsletters that they can subscribe to. For me personally, my newsletters are more about sustaining my own writing and translating practices. And so my readers are actually translators and writers rather than the readers of my books. And so my newsletters are more about literary citizenship. It's about providing value to my community. Sometimes that community will also turn into, some of those folks will turn into readers, but it doesn't happen that often. And so finally, talking about community and citizenship, let's talk briefly about why this matters and how it can fit into your marketing and promotion plan. So why it matters is, number one, a rising tide lifts all boats. If you're going to uplift others like you, other translators from your culture, or even just other translators, because we all need that help, that little boost. it's going to help raise your boat too, at the end of the day. A book takes a village. It takes multiple people to help get that word out there. So if you do that for somebody else, they might turn around and help you with co-promotion. And it helps increase credibility. Do you know, word of mouth works. The reason it works is because when readers see somebody else endorsing your work, they pay a little more attention. Unfortunately, as much work as you can do to promote your own book, you are not the most credible promoter of your own work. I'll repeat that. You are not the most credible. You are the most knowledgeable promoter of your work. You are not the most credible promoter of your work. So you need to get that little bit of help from your peers and other folks. How you do this networking citizenship also matters. It's not just for when you have a book coming out. If you're just going to start kind of, trying to do interviews and help other translators when you have a book coming out, it's evident, right? The people who do this really well, they don't do it because they're looking for something in return. They genuinely believe in doing this because of the widest matter that I mentioned. You may not even get direct reciprocity from the people you are uplifting for everything that you do, but somebody else will notice and they'll help you. They'll step up. And so think of this as karma. Karma. You sow good work and you'll reap it somewhere else. I also recommend small steps. You don't need to do grand gestures. You can just read and share work, pitch an interview, attend book events and of other translators and share those pictures or whatever on social media. Offer to moderate panels. If you have a blog or newsletter, feature some other writer's work or translator's work. Make it part of your practice because you're going to learn. This is how it worked for me. I learned more about the industry and the craft because of this engagement with the community, the translation community. I've learned more as a result, and then I pass that learning on, sharing it on. Widen your lens. You don't have to just focus on translators or authors that are in your language. I've always said translators are historians, anthropologists, we're linguists. We wear multiple hats. Involve or spotlight folks in related fields. I had a session where I invited a historian, for example, who had done work in Gujarati literature. And I invited her to have a conversation with me on a panel, and it was great. So try to think of involving or spotlighting folks in related fields because you're going to find readers in those fields too, right? So think of widening that lens. In closing, I'll just summarize the 5 key points. Start at least 6 months before the book's launch date with these activities. Make sure you're creating a systematic, documented, prioritized plan because, as you've already seen, that lots of moving parts. You don't have to do it all. I'm repeating this from an earlier slide. Be selective. Signal versus noise. That's the most important thing. Your website, as I said earlier, I can't stress this enough. It is your central hub for everything you're creating around this book. Make things easy to find. And finally, what I just said a couple moments ago, literary networking and citizenship is not just for when you have a book coming out. It's something you have to keep doing and genuinely meaning it if you want it to work for you when you need the help. With that, I will close. Here's my bio. Here are my books. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. Here's my contact link. You can go to my website and send me an email through that page, and I will respond. Thank you very much for listening.